Hey, thank you for joining. I'm Kate Stoll, Project Director for the Center for Scientific Evidence in Public Issues, or EPI Center. And our mission is to build trusted relationships between experts and decision makers at all levels of government, with the goal of making it easier for policymakers to access and incorporate scientific evidence into their decision-making processes. We're proud to be part of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, or AAAS, the world's largest general science society. This webinar will be recorded and posted on our event page at the AAAS EPI Center. So bias within automated systems is top of mind for policymakers. We've heard this frequently throughout the 2 years of this project at EPI Center. And as they're considering deploying AI in state and local government, they're concerned about how to mitigate. So we hope you leave this webinar with a better understanding of the practical approaches you and your colleagues can take to empower you to ask informed questions about AI systems currently in use or those you're considering acquiring. We have 2 fabulous speakers today. I'm really excited for you to hear from them. And I'll introduce them both and share a couple more notes, and then we'll jump right in. So Gabriella Waters is an AI and machine learning researcher and the Director of Operations at the Center for Equitable AI and Machine Learning Systems at Morgan State University. She's the director of the Cognitive and Neurodiversity AI Lab, a professor at the Propel Center, where she facilitates the culturally relevant AI ML systems course, and a research associate at NIST, the National Institutes of Standards and Technology, where she leads AI testing and evaluation across 3 teams. She's working on increasing the diversity of thought around technology and focuses on interdisciplinary collaborations to drive innovation, equity, explainability, transparency, and ethics in the development and application of AI tools. Suresh Venkatasubramanian is the director of the Center for Tech Responsibility and a professor of data science, computer science, and the humanities at Brown University. Suresh recently finished a stint in the Biden-Harris administration, where he served as Assistant Director for Science and Justice in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. And there he helped co-author the blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights. He was a member of the Utah State Auditor's Commission on Protecting Privacy and Preventing Discrimination, and he was recently named by Fast Company to their AI 20 list of thinkers shaping the world of generative AI. So they have their full bios on our website, because that was actually just a small part of all the amazing things that they are up to. So let me put our link there so you can see their full bios. And before I turn it over to our speakers, I want to ask in advance for your participation in our survey at the end of today's convening. It only takes a few minutes, I promise. It's anonymous, and your responses are really helpful to know if we're meeting your informational needs. So at the end of the webinar, we'll put the link in the chat, and it'll also pop up when the webinar ends at 3. So thank you in advance to those in the audience for filling it out. And note that we will have a lot of time for audience questions at the end. But if you have questions during the presentations, feel free to put them in the Q&A box and queue them up. We'll try to get to them as many as possible. And we're definitely saving a lot of time for Q&A. So don't be shy and throw your questions in there. So with that, I'll turn it over to Professor Waters and Professor Venkatasubramanian. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Kate. I am really excited to be here. I'm Gabriella Waters, as you heard. And to reiterate, we are going to go through this information quickly so that we can have more time for engagement to answer the questions that you have. So let's start off with the first slide, which is, what is AI? And AI is really about what we call computer systems that are capable of performing complex tasks that usually require some form of intelligence, like decision-making and learning from experience. AI is the umbrella term for a lot of techniques like machine learning, deep learning, natural language processing, and it helps machines adapt to new inputs and execute different types of cognition. So on the next slide, we're going to talk about the difference between predictive AI and generative AI. So typically when people find out that I work in a research center that deals with AI, They assume that I'm doing one of three things: building the Terminator, keeping us safe from the Terminator, or working with ChatGPT. So I want to kind of go through quickly what these two things are. Predictive AI is really about looking at historical data to forecast some future events, trends, outcomes, things like that. So it's about looking for patterns in large data sets. It's about making predictions based on existing information and then forecasting trends. So you see this in areas like finance and healthcare or marketing, because you want to look toward the future for how you can best plan and position yourself. Generative AI is different. That's where your chat GPT comes in. It's not the only generative AI, but that's the best known example. It's about generating original text, images, videos, or other media like audio. And it produces creative outputs based on user prompts. Emphasis on creative. Emphasis on creative. They are designed to mimic human-like content creation in the domains that they are launched in and deployed in. Generative AI usually uses some kind of modeling approach to create these novel creative outputs. So the key difference, generative AI is really about creating new content, and predictive AI is about forecasting future outcomes. So we'll go to the next slide. Big question that is often asked about AI in general is harmful bias and how it is introduced into AI systems. And usually people want to know if it's a source from the training data or if the source is from somewhere else. There are a lot of challenges with harmful bias and training data. There are many reasons why this can exist. It could be unrepresentative sampling. It could be historical harmful bias, label harmful bias. So let me backtrack. Historical bias is about using data that reflects past prejudices or outdated norms that we held in society. So for instance, if you're older, when you picture a teacher, you picture a woman. When you picture a nurse, you picture a woman. That's a historical bias. Men occupy these roles just as often now as women do, but the training data doesn't represent that. So that's a historical bias. Label bias means that the labeling that has gone on in that data set is inconsistent. So you could have different labels applied to the same information when it should be applied consistently throughout. That causes challenges for the agent or the model when it uptakes that information and then tries to make decisions using it. You can have incomplete data, which can cause a bias because now the agent wants to fill in the gaps and it's going to try to fill in with the representations that it's already seen. And you can have selection bias where the data is not representative of the reality that it's meant to model. So if you wanted to have a data set that's used by accountants, but everyone in the data set is a physician, it's not going to give the model really great performance. That's incorrect selection, which creates that harmful bias. Other sources, you can have algorithmic bias, where there are errors in programming or unfair weighting of certain features. You can have human feedback, and not all this is nefarious, but a lot of human feedback is either helpful or harmful, and having a binary classification doesn't give a model enough context for why something is helpful or why something is harmful, and so it can still make mistakes without that information. There are lots of other forms of bias, but we're not going to go through all of those today. I'm not lecturing you. I'm more interested in talking to you. So we're going to go on to the next slide. So here are 4 case studies that we've probably heard about in the media where the agent or the model or the application didn't perform in an optimal way. So we're seeing Amazon scrapping an AI tool, the IRS audits taxpayers who are Black more often than other groups, AI child welfare tool used in Colorado may flag parents with disabilities, what happens when an algorithm cuts your healthcare. These are each examples of models that went awry with harmful bias. And it has real world outcomes. These are not experimental or in silico. These are actual lives that are attached to the outputs of these tools. So it's always going to be very important that we do our due diligence in terms of testing before, well before deployment. And what usually happens is we see headlines like this, and then we go back and redress. That is expensive. It's less expensive to do the testing beforehand versus having to try and redress something or retrain a model from the ground up. So we want to always be looking at how we can be proactive about making sure our models are performing well. And I like to say that they're like a 2-year-old. If you leave them alone and they're being quiet, they're doing something wrong. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Suresh.
Thank you very much. Can we move to the next slide, please? Thank you, Gabriel. So as Gabriel mentioned, there are many different ways in which we want to try and help mitigate sources of bias in these systems. And, obviously, again, I have the same sentiment. I want to hear from you all. I don't want to give you a long lecture on this, but I'll just give you some high points, right? So some of the questions that come up are, first of all, what tools or approaches can be implemented by AI developers, and how can policymakers make sure these tools and approaches are being used? The first part actually is an area of active discussion. There are actually frameworks. IBM has a whole framework for building fair or less unfair systems. Microsoft has frameworks. There's a lot of companies that have built frameworks that can be used by developers, and developers have built their own. I'm teaching a class next semester where I teach students how to put these tools into play. But from a policymaker's point of view, one powerful tool is procurement guidelines. And so, for example, the Office of Management and Budget actually released recently requirements for responsible AI procurement by federal agencies. And the idea being that, in the government, you may not, always know all the details of how to test a system, but you can definitely ask vendors who you're going to buy software from, have you taken appropriate measures to make sure that your systems have been tested, as Gabriel mentioned, before deployment, to make sure that you've mitigated. And I say mitigate, not remove, because it's very hard to remove all forms of bias, but to mitigate bias and unfair forms of bias that you're aware of. Next slide, please. And so there's actually a lot of work at different levels of government and different levels of, shall I say, abstraction as to how to do this, right? So in other words, how to identify biases and how to mitigate them. Gabriel, you work at NIST, and of course, NIST pushed out the AI risk management framework. That is a very detailed list of questions and interrogations that you can ask of your system, or you can ask of someone selling you a system about whether they've tried to map, measure risks, and how they tried to govern them. The blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights that Kate mentioned earlier, that I was part of the team that developed, has it's a long document, and it has very detailed outlines of what kinds of checks and tests should be put into place to make sure your systems are safe, they're effective, they don't discriminate, and they're transparent, and so on. And in addition, as policymakers, if you look at, guidance from the government, the federal government, again, the Office of Management Budget put out their own guidelines back in March of this year, specifically on how to make sure that systems being used by the government that could be impacting our rights or impacting safety have the appropriate checks and balances in place. So that document is quite long. It has a lot of detailed questions and instructions for the development of these systems, the responsibilities for developers, responsibilities for deployers, and so on. Next slide, please. So a lot of this is at the level of the federal government and federal agencies, but there's also a collection of legislation. The one I'm just highlighting here is the most recent one, is a bill that was passed in Colorado that is very comprehensive and looks at consumer protections for AI, and has a bunch of, again, like I said, expectations for developers, expectations for those deploying systems, requirements for pre-deployment testing, requirements for auditing and reporting, especially independent auditing and reporting, and descriptions of how enforcement might take place if systems don't comply with these rules. So these are some of the mechanisms that are in place. And again, we can talk more about this in the Q&A, but there's a lot of material out there in the language that makes sense to policymakers to try and govern AI systems that are being used for either predictive or generative purposes. Next slide, please. And broadly speaking, if you look at what the themes are, there are many different frameworks. There are probably as many frameworks as there are systems out there, but they all fall into this sort of similar bucket of things that before you design a system, you must scope and map out all the different concerns you have and the ways in which you're going to, the concerns that have been raised, you need to be, like, for example, if someone is selling you a system that is to help with hiring or recruitment, then in that case, there are certain issues that are going to come up specific to hiring and recruiting systems. There are certain stakeholders that need to be involved, certain folks are going to be impacted. And all this mapping has to be done ahead of time. And then once you've done the mapping of concerns, you have to be able to measure them and test them. And so once you measure and test, you have to be able to do something with that. You have to analyze and reflect and monitor these systems in real time. And you have to have people in charge, the governance aspect of this, who are keeping track of this. And virtually any robust system for monitoring and governing AI systems looks like this. There's a scoping phase, there's measuring and testing, there's reflection and ongoing monitoring, and there are people in charge of making sure all of this happens in the right way. That's very important. This is not automatic, right? This is governed by people. Next slide, please. So just to end with some takeaways, I have a few and Gabriel has a few. I'll just summarize a few of mine. It is very important to recognize, and I think it's hard to believe this, but it's true. AI might seem scary, but you must trust your own judgment, because your domain knowledge is far more important to assessing the effectiveness of any AI system than AI magic. And if someone comes to you selling AI magic and they can't explain how the system works, do not trust them. You know what you're doing. You in your area, you have the expertise, and AI is not going to replace that. You should also be aware that there are, perhaps they're not perfect, they're imperfect, but they're improving, but acceptable ways to mitigate biases and ensure accountability. If someone comes and says there's no way to do this, they are wrong. Worse, they might be lying, but they're definitely wrong. There are ways, they're not perfect. No one's going to guarantee the system is completely free of bias, but that's not the goal here. The goal is to mitigate things and to make sure we are keeping an eye on how these systems work. And that's how we learn, and that's how we get better at building them. Gabriel, I'll hand it over to you for the other takeaways.
So you're going to hear this phrase repeatedly from the two of us, which is accountability. We absolutely need, and I do appreciate the hand claps and the love that the audience is showing to you, Suresh. I don't want to trample over that. We have to get comfortable demanding accountability and understanding that transparency can mean different things from a vendor. Transparency does not mean you need to see their entire suite of algorithms in an ensemble, but transparency does mean that you should be able to see the results of their testing, evaluation, validation, and verification process. They should be able to give you that information to show that they've been doing this work, to show that they've at least attempted to make sure that their model is going to behave appropriately and it's doing things in the way that it says. If you do model testing, if you do adversarial training / red teaming, if you do some field testing, if you start doing one of those, you would be better off. And explainability is also in hand with transparency. You need to be assured that you know how this agent came to the decision that it did. And if there's no way to explain that, then it's not safe in any real situation. Explainability is the baseline, it's not the ceiling. So sometimes you hear that inverted with sales pitches, but it's really the baseline. If they can't tell you what's going on, I wouldn't put it in a situation where you would have to rely on it to make a decision. Demand that proof of performance, again, reporting from the vendors, being able to see what happens, holding it against the AI RMF, all of that kind of work you can do. It doesn't take an extreme amount of technical know-how to be able to look at what's happening in the different domains that this model or agent is performing in. Don't make any assumptions that it's going to work by default. I love to show an image of someone querying a generative AI system, asking it to give them a picture of salmon in the river. And the picture comes out and it's just large fillets of salmon diving. So these systems are not intelligent. So you need to always demand that proof of performance. Then you have to do your due diligence on your side. AI is heralded as this omni-tool, Swiss Army knife of technologies, and that is not always the case. Your use case may not need an artificial intelligence. It may need just some statistical modeling. It may need something else. So start to look at what is it that you really need and how your use case could stand to benefit in a major way from AI. And on my little soapbox, because I'm in an interdisciplinary center, consider the environmental costs to using these tools. There is a cost associated. And so the ability to shoehorn this tech into everything needs to be tempered by the understanding that you have to use it responsibly.
Thank you both so much. That was a wonderful introduction. And we're starting to see the questions come in. So make sure you look kind of in the bottom of your Zoom window. There's a little Q&A box, and that's where you should go and throw your questions in there. And I'm going to start with one to you, Suresh, that we received from folks as they were registering, as the live questions come in. Practically speaking, so where can cities, counties, and states find, the technical assistance they may need to run equity testing for AI systems that are already deployed, or maybe more realistically, know or ensure that vendors have done such testing? And if you could also give any thoughts on options for cities that are pretty small too, like less than 5,000 people was what one of the questions came in.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I wish I could say, here is a single document, use this and you'll be fine. We're not quite there yet. We're trying to get there, but we're not quite there yet. I think if you have the resources, it's helpful to see if you can bring in-house expertise, folks who have some tech knowledge who can do this. I say this because one of the projects that students at Brown have been running, actually student at Brown and student at Harvard have been running together, is a project called the Paragon Fellowship, where they actually place students in small cities, places to help folks. I know, for example, one of the students at Brown is working with the city of Tempe to help them to build sort of AI literacy material, especially around how to do testing and evaluation of these systems. And he's building he and his team are building a whole set of documents for them. And this is part of the fellowship program. It doesn't cost the city anything. We're the program is funding the students to do this. So there's a lot of programs like this to bring in, reach out to your local universities. I'm sure most places have universities where students have been looking into these issues. I know people at many universities across the country who work in these spaces, for example, and not just in computer science, across the discipline. There's a whole network of universities called the Public Interest Tech University Network, and there's 60 plus universities now across the country where people are doing this research. And someone mentioned the Government AI Coalition. That's a great coalition of cities. There's also the National Conference of State Legislators, and the NCSL does, I know, discussions and hearings about best practices here. So we're still, I think, and also I would love to know from the group, what is it that would be most useful to you, right? You said you wanted information, you want help. Do you want code? Do you want a document? Do you want like a 50-page manual? What is it could be? Is the RMF too much for you? Is it the right level of detail for you? What would be most helpful to you? Well, I think is something that then those of us who work in the space can produce more of that content that would be helpful to you.
I love that idea. So we're definitely open to people throwing in their ideas into the chat of what else do you want from both the technical community, but also the socio-technical community, working across disciplines to think about best solutions here. So actually thinking about tools, Gabriella, I want to ask you, given your expertise and your experience with NIST, can you give us a sense of, are there additional tools that NIST will be putting out in the months and years to make standardization of testing of harmful bias testing a little bit more plug and play, or is that too big to ask?
So harmful bias managed is one of the areas of the risk management framework. And so the work that's being done in the ARIA program is really laying out the foundations and the step-by-step on how you can test your systems, your applications, your models against those actual areas listed in the RMF, with the addition of inclusivity and accessibility. So definitely look out for that. The ARIA program is in its pilot phase right now. If you are interested, you can go to NIST ARIA and you can apply to submit your model for the full program release. We do have the models for the pilot phase. But yeah, definitely be on the lookout for that kind of information forthcoming.
So thank you. And we put the link to the ARIA program in there, so keep an eye out there.
And I'll add one.
I think that there are questions in the Q&A if you want to get to those as well.
Yes, I will do
And
that.
I'll add one more point to this also. In addition to what NIST is doing with ARIA and other programs, the AI Safety Institute, of course, is also building out frameworks, testing methodologies. A lot of their work is focused on AI safety, and that's, you know, it's a concern that you're dealing with in your organization, especially with Gen AI work. That's something that you look out for what the outputs that they'll be producing as well. They're going to be doing a lot of work in this space, putting out tools, methodologies, benchmarks, and things like that. The AI Safety Institute.
Fabulous. Yes, we'll put that in the chat as well. Great. Okay, so I'm seeing questions coming in. I am going to say, let's start with this one. What role will AI play in shaping the future of performance management in the public sector? So do you all have thoughts on how it could be used there?
I mean, it's definitely going to give you a lot of metrics on what people are actually doing, their behaviors, their patterns. Most cities are now smart, so they have the IoT with their sensors that are giving you rich data on where people are going, how they're traveling, how they're getting there. But also, it's a tool that can be leveraged to show effectiveness. If the policies have been implemented, what is the uptake of that? Is it effective in the communities that they're designed for? Are we seeing movement in the right direction? It is able to take all of those data points and consistently track and keep up with them so that you can see almost in real time whether or not a policy change has met the criteria that you had set out for. If it's missing the mark, you'll be more reactive and proactive as a result. So you won't wait so long to make a decision, but you can also make decisions in advance using this technology.
And that's a great point, right? Because I mean, this is exactly right, that if you can monitor, collect data, use that to inform the way you're making your decisions, the way you're instituting policies, that can be very helpful. And nowhere, Gabriella, did you have to say AI. You just said it's just about just good old-fashioned data collection and monitoring and analysis. So again, this is collecting data and using it to inform your decision making is very helpful. The thing to be careful about is if you're trying to essentially replace decision making with AI, and that's when you have to be careful about it.
Wonderful. This next question is for you, Gabriella. How can public sector agencies ensure that AI tools are designed and deployed without reinforcing existing societal biases, particularly in relation to neurodiversity, which I know is a topic of both interest and special expertise?
So I love that the question about neurodiversity was raised because it comes back to that idea of representative data. And the people with neurodiversity aren't really represented equally in training data sets. So you want to make sure that you are getting that diverse data that looks at the entire population, that includes neurodivergent people, that includes people with cognitive differences, that includes people with accessibility challenges, to make sure that your model is ready and prepared to make the right kind of impact in the right ways. You also have to stop relying on the model and actually talk to the actual people. So engaging with the stakeholders, making sure you have wide ranges of experts and regular citizens and a nice, well-rounded population so that you get the best insights. Making sure you're doing iterative testing. You have to do some kind of continuous testing throughout the process and then after deployment, because things can change as it encounters new data. Not all models generalize to unseen data. So you have to constantly be doing that work. You have to perform reviews. You have to have guidelines around this. There has to be policy in your organization that addresses this so that it's a part of the culture and not something that's just tacked on or a box that's checked at the end. And then make sure you have that explainability and accountability, once again, alongside the human oversight.
And can I just sort of
Yeah, of
pile
course.
on with a +100 to that? Because, Gabriella described all the things that you need to do to make sure your system works. And you might be thinking, wait, they told me that it would be cheaper to use AI. I wouldn't need to do all this. And that's the problem. If you believe that it's going to be cheaper to use technology, it will not be. I think, Gabriella, you mentioned this earlier, it'll actually work to be more expensive. But if you put the checks and balances in place, it may not be cheaper, but it can be effective, and it actually can maybe potentially be more inclusive if you've done it thoughtfully and if you're willing to do the work of governance and monitoring. One example that came up on this topic during the pandemic, right? I'm a professor. There's all this concern about doing remote exams and evaluating students, and all these companies were offering cheating services like, oh, your students will take your exams online, and we'll have a system that will monitor from their webcam whether they're cheating. And they would do things like, if you look away from the screen, maybe you're looking at your notes and you're not supposed to. It turned out that one group of people who was affected by this were neurodiverse folks who don't present or their affect in the same way as the AI system was trained to do. Maybe they don't look directly to the camera. Maybe they can't sit, can't sit still, very still in one position for a long period of time. And the systems were flagging them as potentially cheating, which is ridiculous. But it's also because these systems were not trained to keep in mind the variety of experiences people are going to have when working with these systems.
Fascinating. Thank you. And I love seeing the questions coming in. So keep them coming. Now the problem is trying to pick from these great questions. Let's go to another questioner. Is most work in AI done at the developer or designer level, or do we have training and education that's done in the registered apprenticeship model to train more AI professionals? So you could take that a couple ways. So go ahead and choose how you would like.
I don't think there's an apprenticeship model for AI. And the beauty of this tech is that there are 1,000 on-ramps that don't require you to be a computer scientist. And so the nature of it is it lends itself to democratization because there are so many ways to impact this tech where you don't have to code a single line of Python, where you don't have to spend 4 years in differential statistics and algebra and linear algebra and all these other things that Suresh and I are just Google about. You can literally get no code models off the shelf that talk you through in the tutorial on how to change them and how to implement them into your systems. And so this has been the best time to get into this tech world where you don't have to just dip in a toe. You can jump all the way in and you're supported all along the way by all of these ancillary APIs and all of these things that make up an ecosystem that make it easy for you to get into it. But you have to play around with it. You can't assume expertise on day one. So you have to start getting in there and tinkering and not being afraid to do that. One of the things that you can keep in mind is as you're learning out how these work in the early stage, don't deploy them in a high risk situation. Keep it to something low risk, extremely low risk, like build me a shopping list. No one's going to get hurt if it puts the wrong thing on the shopping list, for instance. So try it out, but you don't have to necessarily study at the feet of a master in order to get into and get involved in the uptake in this area. There are so many resources online. There's so many resources at universities where you don't have to be enrolled. They're just living on the websites. So many kinds of modules. So just pick an area, look at the tools that are available and start making like AI technologies are like a puzzle or like a Lego set where you keep constructing until you build out what it is you need specifically. And you can make it as tuned as that. I guess I'm dating myself because when I was first introduced to Legos, there were no models that you just got the bricks and then you just built what you want. So think of it in that way, that it doesn't come in a box with a picture on it. It just comes in component parts that you can then layer together to create what it is you're looking for.
I mean, the main machine learning conference where academics go to sort of present their work just happened, or is happening right now I think in Vancouver or somewhere. And they have a new track this year for high school students to present their work in AI, and
Cool.
so I guess that's It's an interesting direction, but it also shows that at that level, it's possible to play and come up with creative solutions using AI, even if you don't necessarily understand the entire stack. And so there's lots of things you can do there to Gabriella's point about the on-ramps.
Yeah, we have middle schoolers who are coding and building. We have a program for middle schoolers.
There you go.
And if you're curious about how we got them to sit still long enough, it was Roblox.
There you go.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
My kids will attest to that too.
Listen, I know.
So actually, following up on something you said, Gabrielle, about like choose some lower risk applications and play with it, actually connects quite well to another question is, we know that there are many different kinds of applications of AI tools used by governments. Are there some kinds of AI that present more risk for biased outcomes than others? And in other words, are there some kinds of tools that decision makers should be paying extra attention to?
So anything that's going to analyze populations is more likely to, and be affected by these kinds of harmful biases because the training data tells you certain things. The features are weighted a certain way depending on demographics, whether it's age, whether it's zip code, whatever it is. The training data itself isn't new. It's just an aggregate of everything we've known so far. And so it may say that people who are 70 years old are most likely dementia patients who have bad mobility, all of these different kinds of things that aren't true for everyone and aren't representative for everyone who's 70 plus years old, or that they're all retired, which is not the case. So looking at tools that are likely to encounter that kind of information, they're going to probably struggle a bit more if you don't do something to intervene. Systems that rely on things like computer vision are going to be challenged. So identifying individuals, making the right calls on who was where and when, and if this is the person or not the person, and all of these kinds of things. And there's another image that I save on my phone where it's an undergrad student. He's about 2 shades darker than I am. His hair is in a fade, so his haircut is a little higher. The computer has drawn a box around his face and said he is Barack Obama. So the computer vision is a very high risk area for looking at how things can go awry if there are no interventions. So we don't think computer vision is used as often as it is, but it actually is. Sometimes when you enter facilities in the public, your face is being compared as you walk in to make sure you are safe, you're not on any particular lists. Your face is being captured as you walk down the street, if there are monitoring systems available. So you see these in airports. You can opt out of having your face, photo taken in the airport, but in some places you can't opt out. So looking at systems that use anything that's going to be open to interpretation is going to have a little bit of a challenge, because as smart as we think these systems are, they are always absent of context. So they cannot reason, I'm putting that in quotes, their cognition models don't allow them to extrapolate further. It's flat. Everything is flat. And the model is attempting to homogenize the heterogeneous. So anytime you're seeing that, you're going to see challenges.
So the OMB memo that I mentioned, which draws on material from the blueprint, says the following, right? That AI systems that are implicated in this way are those that might affect your civil rights or civil liberties or privacy in many ways. Systems that affect your opportunities for advancement, whether it's equitable access to education, housing, insurance, credit, employment, or even ability to access public benefits or critical government services, healthcare, financial services, public housing. And in fact, that OMB memo has a long list in there, one of the appendices, which you can take a look at and see. And there's it's in the document. It includes blocking speech, law enforcement context, risk assessments and immigration, biometric identification, detecting emotions, screening tenants, so housing, credit, employment, virtually, all of these areas, there are known risks, known issues with bias, And that's why they show up in these what are called high risk categories. And so you'll find even legislation across the world, like the EU AI Act, has a whole list of high risk sectors where these systems need to undergo careful scrutiny. So there's a lot of information out there that says what is considered high risk and what might not be.
So actually, I'm going to follow up on that because there was another question about, is there a possibility, or are you seeing signs of harmonization of regulations at the national or global level, city, local, county, state? Or do you think we're going to get a patchwork where you have different regulatory frameworks? So
there's
yeah.
Yeah, there's different levels of coordination. I was just at a meeting, for example, in San Francisco of AI safety institutes, of which there are now 10 across the world, all trying to coordinate on ways to test and evaluate systems that are being put out in the world. So there's coordination among those 10 countries that include the US, it includes all of the EU, it includes United Kingdom, Canada, Kenya, Japan, Korea, and a couple of other countries as well. So that's one example. There are interactions at the level of the US and the EU. There's a Trade and Technology Council trying to sort of harmonize things around the AI Act versus what might happen in the US as well. There are coordinating groups at the level of states. So there's a multi-state working group with legislators from multiple states trying to figure out consensus sort of language around bills around AI that they're trying to put in different settings. There's, of course, the GovAI coalition, things happening at the city level. So there are different levels at which coordination is happening, but there are also different state level legislation. There isn't right now likely prospect of any federal legislation, although there's some things sitting in Congress waiting. So I would expect a patchwork, if at all, but there is at least some attempt to coordinate among the different groups, and there's some common themes. We have a project going on where hopefully in a month or two we'll have something more to say about synthesizing what's happening across the states on AI.
Great. We look forward to seeing that. Okay, here's another question. How do you quantify ethics and equity in AI or machine learning systems? And what are some of the common challenges in these processes?
Well, we have things like the fairness metrics, we have impact metrics, you have audit, techniques, you have ways to measure equity in different domains. So I think it depends on, which of those are going to make sense for the situation that you're in. I think the challenges there are we don't have a universally agreed upon definition of ethics. Like whose ethics, when, under what conditions. AI is simple, but very complex. And how it's used and developed is very complex. In universities and in NIST, we have to complete an IRB process before we can develop anything and use it with humans. In industry, that's not the case. You have carte blanche to create whatever you want and sell it, and then we find out together if that's working in an acceptable way or if it's not. So there's a disconnect between how things are done in one area versus another that makes it more challenging to have this like standard quantification system, because universities are held to a different standard and the industry isn't really held to as many standards. So the goals are also conflicting. Some people are designing AI purely for profit. Some are designing them for humanitarian reasons. Some are designing them for, supporting procurement in states and local governments. So we have to sort of piecemeal a lot of things together until we agree on one sort of framework that has a baseline foundation of elements that we can all work with, and then we can get specificity within our own particular use cases. But we have just like we have the Constitution, all the states in the United States follow the Constitution, and they build their own constitutions as well. So the underlying document or standard has to be developed, and then we can see more of the fairness metrics are what we are going to use, or we're going to use the fairness metrics and we're going to use these metrics, and this is how we're going to look at equity. And until then, it's still the water's muddied, and we just have to do a better job of having this conversation collectively and not in conversations behind closed doors without the stakeholders.
I want to encourage people to think about this perhaps in the following way, right? You're driving a car, and you have a bunch of indicator lights that come on your car. Oh, maybe your oil is low, or your gas is low, or brake pads need to be replaced, or something like that. You get these indicators that come on, right? You don't have a single thing that says your car is fine. What you have are indicators that indicate that there could be problems in different aspects. You apply your judgment, okay, my windshield wiper fluid is low. I can deal with that later. That's not a big problem. Oh my God, my brakes are looking worn. I got to deal with this now. You know that because you understand at some level how the car operates. If you think of the measures, the metrics, the things, I find it helpful to think of them as sensors. A measurement might go off. You might say, oh, there's a certain element of bias here. The fact that the measurement goes off and says there's a bias somewhere doesn't mean the system is broken. But the absence of a signal doesn't mean the system is working either. But having these systems, these sensors in place together, and that's why it's good to have different kinds of fairness measures, different kinds of measurements, different kinds of stakeholder monitoring, allows you, the person who knows the domain, who's the expert, to get a picture of what could be going wrong. And that way AI can be very helpful as a set of diagnostic tools. What you should try to avoid thinking about is AI as replacing your judgment in the process. If you think of it as sensors and alarms that go off that you will then integrate into your understanding to make a judgment, that I find to be a more effective use of these tools than as replacements for our judgment.
I love that analogy. That's great. We're gonna keep using that one, Suresh. It's awesome. Okay, here's another question about sensitive information and using AI. So how should policymakers or government officials that work with sensitive personal or supervisory information approach using AI tools? Are there safe ways to use these tools without feeding sensitive data into AI models that you didn't mean to?
I don't want to present this as 100% foolproof because this is the purpose of adversarial testing, because people are always finding creative ways to circumvent the safeguards. So we're always going to have a process for that. There are methods of de-identifying and anonymization and things like that we all know. There are also techniques like federated learning and all of these other things that will help to preserve privacy, but there is no technique that's 100% foolproof. So you have to layer these in a way that makes sense. You can't rely on just one. It's like the potato chips commercial. You can't stop at just one. You have to have multiple to make sure, beyond just encryption, beyond just de-identification, beyond just the federated learning, beyond just your adversarial testing, that you have a process for how you do this work continuously. It is never a one and done. It's not the set it and forget it. You have to constantly be interrogating your system to make sure that it remains robust. You do not, and you would not feed a child one time and then see them at high school graduation. You are constantly nurturing them and taking care of them. And that's how you have to approach security in these systems and protecting that data as much as you can, and always be looking at the latest techniques and testing them out and looking at what's going on.
And by adversarial testing, you mean someone else coming in and trying to break in and see what goes wrong?
It can be someone from outside, it can be someone from inside. I recommend both. Okay. Your team knows your system, and the way they adversarially test it is going to be different than a person would from outside of your system. So it's like when you develop your AI and you test it internally, this is your baby inside, that's my sweet little baby. But the real world is like, whose kid is this? And it's a whole different interaction. So you want to make sure that you get both, because your model or your agent isn't going to be used by just your team. It's going to be deployed in reality, and you have to test it with reality.
Great, thank you. Okay, let's see. How can local governments leverage AI to improve their decision-making processes while ensuring transparency to constituents?
I mean, you have to already have a process in place that you are already reporting out to your constituents. AI isn't going to improve on a process you don't already have implemented. So you want to make sure that you're already doing this, because your AI is supposed to augment and enhance, not take the place of. So if you're not doing that already, you need to start, and then you need to look at how AI can then communicate that information out in a way that makes sense. So you're constantly looking at, okay, what's my pipeline for communication from inception of an idea to drafting of a bill to passing the bill, whatever the use case is. And then seeing where AI can fill in those gaps. Can AI, show a summary of that bill appropriately at the bottom so that it makes sense in the public's consciousness for why this is necessary? It can grab information about previous bills that are related to this and how this improves upon or takes the place of, it can leverage those kinds of things after you insert it into your current pipeline.
Great. So here's a question that comes up a lot when talking about AI and harmful bias is, it seems like a lot of the potential bias for AI is the same as for human intelligence. Has there been any comparisons of the risks of AI versus human decision-making for government or non-government with respect to discrimination?
I mean, it's tricky. I think I understand the question as being, well, humans are biased too, right? So and I think it's a reasonable point. I think the way I like to think about this is not so much that the goal of AI or the hope of AI is to remove human bias. What often ends up happening is that the bias gets shifted around. And it gets shifted around in a way that is much harder to investigate. So in other words, so you have a human decision maker. So you're in some setting, you have human decision makers, maybe, I don't know, I didn't get my coffee today. I'm feeling a little grumpy. I'm going to make a decision that maybe is not the best decision possible because I'm not, and that's a form of bias, right? And we would like to use systems that don't need coffee. God help us, all systems need coffee, but if they don't need coffee to sort of make these decisions. The problem is that maybe they won't make a decision based on not having coffee, but they could make a bad decision based on bias in the data or skews and patterns that they found. So what happens is that when you go from a human decision maker with our own opacities, our own cultural expectations, our own biases to an AI decision maker, first of all, it is using trained data labeled by humans. So it's not free of human biases, even in its own training. Secondly, because of the way these systems are trained and built, they absorb patterns, skews in ways that we wouldn't expect. They find weird correlations that the system thinks is reasonable to conclude, to make predictions on, that may not be reasonable at all, that may not make sense in the world. So the bias gets shifted. And so you can't just assume that it is the same kind of biases that humans display. It's a different kind, and you have to evaluate it on its own terms.
Great. So we probably have time for one more question. So here's one in the Q&A. Following the trend of moving from broad theoretical frameworks to use case specific research, what are some specific use cases or applications or even sectors that you think require the most monitoring and guidance right now, especially when we're talking about public sector?
Healthcare.
Mm.
Healthcare is a huge one. The traffic systems are another huge one. If you need me to be more specific on why, please feel free to follow up. But these are high risks implementations of the tech. And anytime you have a high risk implementation in any section where people's lives are directly impacted, you need a lot of monitoring. You need to be absolutely sure. In healthcare, an example is models have been trained to scan images of the eye to look for the presence of diabetic retinopathy. Their accuracy rate is almost exactly the same as a human. But every hospital everywhere has a human ophthalmologist confirm whether or not they agree or disagree with the model's decision before it is given to the patient. So even with accuracy well over 90%, you still need to have that oversight in that situation because it's high risk. If you don't do that and you get the wrong diagnosis, that is the difference between someone having a sight and not having sight. And so anything that's high risk, anything in any sector needs to have that continuous monitoring.
I'll throw out another example, which is fairly high risk, public benefits. So there's a big temptation to use AI to do things like fraud detection if people are illegitimately applying for benefits. Time and time again, we have found that all these systems do is flag people unjustly for fraud for no good reason, and people are denied benefits, and these are people who often need these benefits the most. And so there's a whole, there's a colleague of mine, Kevin DeLiban, has just started a nonprofit who's been investigating. He's been investigating sort of denial of benefits in different parts of the country, and it's a huge issue. It comes up over and over again, especially because the temptation is very high. Oh, we will minimize fraud and waste by using AI, and inevitably what happens is that people who deserve to get the benefits they're asking for are not getting it, and they really need it. So
Thank you. And so at this point, we're gonna start wrapping up. I know we didn't get through all the questions, but we got through a lot of them, and really appreciate the audience for throwing in so many thoughtful questions. I want to point out a new resource. So Gabriella and Suresh raised it a few times today that being informed about what AI services you're acquiring is essential to responsible AI use. So we've recently released a new resource we're calling Key Questions for Government Leaders to Ask When Considering the Use of AI Systems. I'm going to put the link in the chat for folks who want to check out that resource. And then I will ask you again to reply to our survey at the end, because we really do want to know what type of information is most useful to you all, especially as you're working at state and local government levels. What's the type of information, access to experts that is most helpful to you as you're making these important decisions? So with that, I will say thank you all for joining today. Thank you so much to Gabriella and Suresh for sharing your expertise and your amazing analogies. Very memorable and such an engaging conversation. So thank you so much. Thanks to all the participants for joining today. Please stay in touch with us. We're EPI Center, so it's EPI Center at AAAS.org. We're always happy to hear from folks. Yeah, I'll put my email right there. So we would love to hear from you all. And with that, we will close out and just thank our speakers once again.
thank you.
Thank you for having us.